In a world where justice is defined by men in power, how can a misunderstood woman truly be protected? Susan Glaspell's A Jury of Her Peers, published March 5th, 1917, is not only a murder mystery, but also represents how underlying gender and societal expectations shape perceptions of ethics. Hello, my name is Layla MacDonald, and this is my final summative presentation for Miss Rush's Grade 12 English course. This short story follows the investigation of John Wright's murder, led by the county attorney and the sheriff, who bring their wives along. While the men focus on hard evidence, the wives begin to notice small details that reveal Mr. Wright's abuse from her husband. They begin to sympathize and relate with Miss Wright, influencing the wives' decision to corrupt the scene and protect her from the men's judgment. While the story unfolds, Glaspell reveals an underlying crime: the silent struggles of women at men's mercy. A Jury of Her Peers explores themes of gender roles, justice and morality, oppression of women, and psychological abuse in relationships. Feminism certainly offers the most prominent lens, as the story is based in the early 20th century, reflecting a significant difference in gender roles in comparison to today. Each wife in the story is financially dependent on their husbands, reflecting how women were historically believed to be secondary to men and expected to tend to their husbands rather than earning an income. The wives notice evidence of mistreatment, like him being cheap with her clothes or letting her fruit preserve jars burst in the night, piecing together Miss Wright's motive for the crime. But the men investigating don't take their wives' ideas seriously. Instead, they belittle them, laughing about women's odd concerns, reinforcing traditional gender roles that dismiss women's opinions as secondary and view them as incapable of contributing. In response, the wives silently unite in solidarity, connecting over their shared oppression. This leads them to clean Miss Wright's mistakes and hide a crucial piece of evidence. In doing so, they are challenging the traditional male dominated justice system, acknowledging the systematic oppression that women face, and not allowing the men to punish Miss Wright without context. This situation reminds me of The Dragon by Catherine Govier, when the psychiatrist overlooked his male patient as being an issue in their relationship and instead attacked his innocent wife, punishing her immediately without an attempt at knowing her truth. The two stories show both sympathizing with your own gender over shared trauma from the opposing gender, as well as men disregarding women's experiences and traumas. The feminism critique heavily relates to the new historicism lens that A Jury of Her Peers can be viewed through as well. The story was written in 1917, a time when women weren't even able to vote in Canada, and their roles in society were mainly limited to the upkeep of the home and raising children. When the husbands in the story dismiss their wives' ideas, confine them to domestic duties, and dictate their lives, they are again reinforcing the patriarchal system that places women as second-class citizens. The generational expectation of women to maintain the domestic sphere and be secondary to their husbands reminds me of the poem For My Mother by Lorna Goodson. The poem follows a mother who relentlessly cares for the domestic sphere, and while she does endure psychological trauma from her husband's possible infidelity, she does not voice any issue or complaints. Once again, representing the generational expectation of women to adhere to the traditional sexist roles in the male dominated patriarchal system. A Jury of Her Peers can also be viewed through a Marxist lens. In this instance, we can view John Wright as the wealthy class or the bourgeoisie, and Minnie Foster as the working class or the proletariat. Since Mr. Wright is the person of the household earning income and dictating how money is spent, Minnie Foster is forced into having little to no agency in her own life. She is oppressed by the bourgeoisie and subject to economic and social constraints. As she is dominated, she is suppressed from her freedom and individuality. She won't go out because she can't purchase decent clothes for herself, and her husband won't buy them for her. Her confinement into the home is a reflection of a capitalist society that throughout history has limited the proletariat's opportunity and personal fulfillment. A similar instance occurs in the story The Diamond Necklace by Guy de Maupassant, when the wife refuses to attend her husband's company party unless she is dressed to the nines. Both cases reveal how clothing and appearance, especially for women, play a significant role in social perception, as each woman will not appear in society due to fear of being judged, again representing the restraints and judgment that the proletariat faces in a capitalist society. When noticing the younger version of Miss Wright, who is Minnie Foster, the view is guided towards a psychological lens. Contrasting Minnie Foster and Miss Wright showcases the years of psychological trauma inflicted by Mr. Wright, ultimately changing her persona. When Miss Hale mentions Minnie Foster in her younger years, she describes her as lively, wearing nice clothes and singing in the choir. But Miss Wright is unrecognizable from Minnie Foster. She is isolated, quiet, and depressed from years of emotional abuse and neglect from her husband. As she is silenced, her feelings are repressed. This relates to Sigmund Freud's theory that repression is the root of people's mental struggles. And though these feelings are repressed into the unconscious mind, they can resurface in disturbing forms, like how Miss Wright had finally had enough and strangled her husband. Similarly, in the short story Man Descending, there are two examples of resurfaced repressed emotions. Firstly, when the wife has been dealing with her husband's childishness for their whole marriage until she eventually commits infidelity. And secondly, when the husband deals with her cold withdrawnness following her affair, his feelings eventually resurface as he attempts to fight the other man. Another way to interpret this story is through the reader response theory lens. Depending on the reader and their background, it can depict how Minnie Wright's crime is interpreted. For example, a person who has dealt with feelings of emotional neglect, psychological abuse, or toxic partnerships and gender roles are more likely to empathize with Minnie's character and justify her actions. On the other hand, a person who has no personal connection to these traumas or views murder as an inexcusable act are more likely to focus on the moral implications of Minnie's crime rather than the psychological background infiltrating it. A couple ways that this short story reminds me of The Wars by Timothy Finley are firstly the historical implications of women and men's traditional roles. Men fighting in the wars and making contributions to society and their country, while women stay in the domestic sphere, tending to the men when needed. Secondly, when the wives and a jury of her peers feel empathy towards Miss Wright because of her situation, persuading their morality to hide the bird, it reminds me of how in the wars Robert Ross felt empathy towards his disabled sister and her situation, becoming her caregiver and eventually reflecting on his morality when he struggles to hurt innocent beings while other men at war do so carelessly. Both situations showcase how experience and empathy influence morality. Moving on, Susan Glaspell uses many literary devices to enhance the themes and captivation of the narrative, starting with the most prevalent device used, symbolism. The dead bird is the most important use of symbolism in the story, representing Minnie Foster's abuse from her husband. There are already reasons that Minnie won't go out into society following her husband's abuse to her, but when the bird is strangled by him, it destroys the only friendship she had left, representing her secludedness and isolation driven by him. Eventually, the bird mirrors Mr. Wright's own strangulation when Minnie commits her crime against him. Adding to the use of symbolism, the quilt Minnie is sewing represents her own life through erratic stitches. Though she was clearly capable of maintaining good stitching patterns, the nervous display of stitches embodies her mental state prior to the crime. Furthermore, the preserved jars in the story that her husband let burst symbolize Minnie's own mental state and how she was withstanding so much pressure that eventually she bursted in reaction to her husband's actions. Another prevalent device used is irony. While the husbands are the ones deemed as more capable by society, the wives that they brought to tag along begin to find the true motives behind the crime, proving how the wives who are ironically being dismissed by the husbands are actually the more capable characters in the story. Glaspell uses foreshadowing before revealing the strongest piece of evidence, the bird. She builds up the case with smaller, less obvious clues like the fruit preserve jars or the quilt stitching. Another example of foreshadowing takes place at the beginning of the story, when Miss Hale is dragged out of her kitchen by her husband, abruptly leaving the space dirty with flour half sifted. This instance helps her later relate to the unkemptness of Minnie's kitchen and how both could have been kept tidy if the husbands didn't interfere. Minnie's unkempt kitchen is also an example of imagery, as the area physically displays Miss Wright's inner turmoil, messy and chaotic. In conclusion, Glaspell explores themes of gender, justice, and abuse in her story, A Jury of Her Peers. The story reveals that the real crime isn't simply the murder of Mr. Wright, but the years of emotional abuse he inflicted on his wife who suffered silently. The wives in the story, though undermined by the men, are the ones who understand by relating to Minnie's struggles, which is how they uncover the truth. Glaspell uses symbolism, irony, and foreshadowing to show that circumstance and understanding are important when assessing a crime. Ultimately, the story challenges traditional patriarchal ideas of justice, highlighting how gender roles can influence the treatment of women and the way they are judged in a male dominated society.